All right, Carlos hasn't seen this video yet. This one cracked me up. This is from some career lifetime propagandist from the U.S. State Department. You know, just one of these suits, one of these stooges, who's supposed to um, toe the State Department line and put out State Department propaganda talking points. But he made a bit of a slip up here.
A few things. So I will say, with respect to your first question, we believe the war has been a strategic failure for Ukraine. The secretary spoke to this in a speech he gave in Helsinki last month, I believe it was. What's that? So, I'm sorry, excuse me, a strategic failure for Ukraine. Thank you for the correction. Which is, I need more than one correction today. A strategic, this is the first time at the podium for a week. I'm a little.
This is my first time at the podium telling the truth. Sorry. I'll get back to lying in a second here.
That's like Bush's a brutal criminal invasion of Iraq, and he's like, "Ah, shit. Well, I guess Iraq too." But those are called Freudian slips, which means that the sort of unconscious truth that we recognize but don't want to say it explicitly, it ends up coming out, and that's what it is. It's been a tremendous failure for Ukraine, and honestly, if you really wanted to be fully truthful, for the U.S. and for the NATO forces that proved in the arena of universal history that they've lost the power that they had a few decades ago, and that they just can't complete the objectives that they have, and toppling the government in Russia, and their objectives in this proxy war against Russia just have been a complete failure. And that's not to say that the special military operations have gone fully as planned, but it's been very clear that Russia has been undoubtedly winning this war. And even though Ukraine has all the backing of NATO and NATO military forces and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars from the U.S. alone, it's been a tremendous defeat, just a squashing defeat.
And while Russia has been focused on what they need to do militarily and economically, geopolitically, in terms of forming alliances, the U.S. has been hyper focused on fighting the information war. Basically censoring any dissent and trying to put out this narrative that we need to fight to the last Ukrainian, for one, and that what this guy was trying to say there, but he accidentally told the truth, that this has been a strategic failure for Russia and Ukraine is winning. That's far from the truth. And now I think the information war is sort of starting to unravel for the U.S. now that this Ukrainian counteroffensive has failed so miserably. I've seen even some of just the most blatant, pro-Ukraine propagandists who would praise Ukraine and say they were winning in pretty much any situation. Even them admitting that the counteroffensive hasn't gone to plan, that it's basically been a failure strategically for Ukraine. Like this guy just let slip here. So yeah, it's going to be tough for the U.S. to continue lying, and it always takes a few months or a few years after the conflict before we start learning what was really going on behind the scenes completely. So I'm sure there will be a lot of people now who come out against the proxy war, who have been against the proxy war the whole time it was going on. Better late than never, I guess. But yeah, I mean, and we've gotten to see this firsthand as people who have been critical of the proxy war effort since day one. Like when Russia invaded, I think we lost 1,000 followers on Instagram because people were like, "You Russian imperialist bastards, how dare you not stand for the people of Ukraine, the wonderful liberal democracy of Ukraine." And with time and with the new stories that are have been coming out, with the each new U.S. action, like the terrorist attack on Nord Stream 2, people have begun to see this for what it is, a NATO proxy war, a U.S. imperialist project to try and threaten Russia and prevent Russia's economic development, prevent Russia from keeping control of their own energy sector and, continuing to sell energy to countries in Europe who the U.S. wants to keep a monopoly on as a trade partner. So, yeah.
Yeah, and the narrative is just it's starting to crumble, and you saw it a few weeks ago, maybe even a month ago, with the New York Times article where what was basically implied was that the level of Nazis in Ukraine's army is feeding into the Russian propaganda about Nazis in Ukraine's army. It's like it was such a contradictory headline where one part of the headline implied the truth of what the other part considered to be propaganda and false. So it's cracks in the narrative are slipping through, and uh, social media, although it's been able to be used as a force where uh, propagandizing people and indoctrinate them, if you want to use that term, is much easier than ever, especially if you accept this analysis that comes from uh, the German Chinese philosopher Hans-Georg Müller, that today we construct our identity through the curation of our profiles, and therefore what we post, the relationship that we have to like our political views when we post them is much deeper than before. Like before, you had the ability to separate like your authentic self from like your political positions, right? Today, who you are is tied to your profile, and your profile is necessarily political. You have to constantly comment on ethical and political questions. And so on one side, it's made propaganda much more entrenched than in years past. Like people's identities are conjoined to the political opinions that they put in their profiles. But on the other side, it's allowed spaces for dissenting opinions to almost sometimes accidentally break through the narrative, and there's an openness in at least a large chunk, I think, of the American people to see beyond the dominant narrative and look for alternative opinions, and that makes them susceptible to these sort of alternative opinions that are really just feeding into the dominant narrative. But it also makes them susceptible to people who are just speaking in the ways that we do, and similar voices who are critical in a form that is substantially critical of the existing order.
Absolutely. And I mean, you see that on TikTok, with, their social media is also a way to get information out, but it's also a form of brainwashing. And this is where the forms of controlled counter hegemony are so valuable to the ruling class, because you have a lot of kids radicalizing on TikTok, but then you have these figures like Vaush, who pull them into a community and an ideology that's completely compatible with the status quo, with neoliberal capitalism and with the ruling class. So, yeah. And then being part of that online community in turn becomes part of their identity. And yeah, it's really nefarious the way that the ruling class is using social media to control thought.